All right, it's good to be back. I'm still waking up at 3:30 a.m. each day. So at this point, I'm fading fast. I'm hoping Shabbat kind of resets my body clock this weekend. But we've got a great Torah portion this week, Vayechi. It just feels strange to study it so late in the week instead of earlier in the week. But it'll be good to get back on schedule, because if there's one thing I've noticed is if you're going to study the Torah, there almost has to be a schedule, or life really wedges its way in there and starts to crowd it out. So unless you have that appointed time somewhere in your week, it's really hard to get anything done. It's important, because I think growth comes through routine, and having that routine really helps us grow. So Vayechi, I'll do something. I did it with the day class earlier today, and we've never done it before. We do it in our congregation, but we haven't been doing it in the online study because it's a little less formal. It's not like a Shabbat service. But remembering that we do have people at all levels of learning. We have people who don't know the Aleph Beit, but then we probably have people who can read the Hebrew text as well or better than I can. So we don't want to leave behind people who may have never had the background of a formal Torah study. And so I thought for this week, one of the beginner things that we could try is we could look at the Torah blessings. When you study the Torah, it's traditional that you make a blessing before you read, and then when you're done reading, you make a blessing after you read. And if you've never done that, just think of it as an opportunity to have a capital letter at the beginning of a sentence and a period at the end. It gives you a starting and a stopping place. It gives you a sense of closure. And it's just a great opportunity to, like it says, pray without ceasing. How can you pray without ceasing? It means you just take every opportunity throughout the day to thank or acknowledge or praise or worship the Father for what He's given you. And so in the Torah blessings, that's what you're doing. You're acknowledging the Father for the blessing of being able to not just have the Torah, but to be able to study it. So if you've never done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to screen share with you the blessing. And make a recommendation too, because, okay, move down, there you are. This particular blessing, it's found in Jeremiah Greenberg's Messianic Shabbat Siddur. It's a great little Siddur. We use it at our congregation. And it has the advantage not just of large Hebrew letters, but of an English translation and a transliteration. So maybe you have no idea what an aleph or a tav is, but if you want to say the words anyway, you have a transliteration. Or if you're learning to read Hebrew and you want to check yourself, did I pronounce that correctly? Then you can peek over there at the transliteration and see, was my pronunciation good on that particular letter? Or if you get lost, it's not unknown if you get up in front of people and you start trying to sing in Hebrew or say a blessing in Hebrew, that you would get lost. And so you can always take a sneak peek over the transliteration and correct yourself if you need to. So it's a great resource. He doesn't just have Shabbat Siddurs. He's got all sorts of resources, like for the holidays and so forth. You can even purchase like this. We purchased for the congregation the PowerPoints of the Siddur, so that if you're leading a congregation with a big screen, you can pick which pieces of, we call it liturgy, or which prayers you want the congregation to do together. you can project them onto the screen, and then everybody's looking at the same thing. So you don't necessarily have to have the book. And here's a picture of Jeremiah smiling as usual. And as far as I know, he still lives in Tennessee. And if you do order from him, just mention where you heard about him. And he does a great job, I think. I mean, I know there's other things out there, but his heart, his spirit is really good. And he has a great attitude, even toward non-Jews, wanting to learn the prayers and so forth. And you don't always get that attitude coming out of Messianic Judaism. So he's a great guy. So you have two parts when you're going to do a Torah blessing in your congregation. The Aliyah is the person who's called up to the bima to read from the Torah, because Aliyah means to go up, and the Torah is always read from the bima, or the higher place of the congregation. So it's kind of responsive. You'll have the Aliyah interacting with the congregation concerning the Torah scroll. Or if you don't have a scroll, it may just be you're using your Bible. Sometimes you could just have a Tanakh and you could read out of that. I guess it depends on skill level, whether your congregation would read it in Hebrew or in English, or a combination. Sometimes it's good if you don't really know the Hebrew that well, like you don't want the congregation to sit there while you take forever to read it. Maybe you could do the first verse in Hebrew and then move to English. Any little practice like that improves your hearing of Hebrew and your reading of Hebrew. So the Aliyah would have the Torah scroll open, and the Aliyah would bow toward the congregation and say, "Blessed is the Lord, the Blessed One." And then the congregation will respond. They will bow in return and say, "Blessed is the Lord, who is blessed for all eternity." And then the Aliyah goes ahead and says the complete blessing. He'll repeat, or she, "Blessed be the Lord, who's blessed for all eternity. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has chosen us from all peoples and has given us his Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord, giver of the Torah." And then the congregation responds, "Amen." So here you can see a sample. Let me see if I can, that might be easier to see, which now I can't see, but I'm supposed to know this, right? So you can see reset that cursor. Okay, now you can see how nice and big the Hebrew letters are. And so again, Jeremiah gives you the transliteration. So even if you can't read those Hebrew letters, you can still sing along. So the reader, again, bows and says, "Baruch hu et Adonai hamevorach." And then the congregation, they bow back and they say, "Baruch Adonai hamevorach leolam va'ed." Pretty easy. And then the Aliyah will continue on with the full blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. And the congregation says, "Amen." It's that easy. So that's how you open up. And then there's also a blessing to close it. And once the reading is completed, the Aliyah will say, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has given us a Torah of truth and has planted eternal life in our midst. Blessed are you, O Lord, giver of the Torah." It's also customary, if you're doing this in a congregation, to stand for the reading of the Torah, because that's the pattern in Scripture. The people stood for the hearing of the Torah, and then you can be seated after that reading. And then if you wanted to actually sing the little song. There's the transliteration down there, or you can read the Hebrew up top, the closing blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torat emet, v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. And again, the congregation would say, Amen. And again, this is just a little slice out of a congregational situation. When the Torah scrolls rolled back up, the Aliyah, or whoever's going to return the Torah to the ark, would hold up the Torah scroll, and you do a little tune, the V'zot HaTorah, which means, and this is the Torah that Moses placed before the children of Israel at the command of the Lord by Moses' hand. And it goes like this. It's real easy. V'zot HaTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei Yisrael al pi Adonai b'yad Moshe. Okay, so there you got it. Some of you have been wanting to learn a little bit of the liturgy, so there's just a tiny bit right there. So let's move ahead. We did our reading in the earlier class today, so I'm not going to read those sections over again. And you can go back through the recording and look at some of the comments we made about these pictures and the burial cave. The main thing, or the main point that I was trying to make for the class, it's coming from the name of the Torah portion, Vayechi, and you heard B'chayei in the Torah blessing, right? Who has planted eternal life within us. And you can hear the verb form, lichiyot, lichiyot. And within that verb form, you can see the chet and the yod. And if you pull out the chet and the yod, you have the Hebrew word chai. Like Am Yisrael chai, the people of Israel live. You see that often on a Jewish necklace. They'll have a chet with a yod. It stands for chai, or life. And so where it says, and Jacob lived, Vayechi, and lived. And so when you look at these graves, that was the point of having all these pictures up there, so that you could see what it meant to be gathered to your fathers, or to lie down with your fathers, which is what Jacob is asking of Joseph. After I die, don't leave me here. Take my bones back to Hebron, bury me there. And I wanted you to see how that was accomplished, both literally, and then maybe you can get kind of a spiritual picture out of it. On the left-hand side of the picture, and this is overlooking, this is a graveyard of the Kohanim, right outside of the Zion Gate, across the Gershon Valley, from the Zion Gate going into the city. So it's overlooking Gershon, overlooking hell, but it's on the shoulder of Hinnom. It's up higher, overlooking. And so they found the bones of priests dated all the way back to the 1st century in this graveyard. And they were able to very easily see the picture of early burial. Now it changed somewhat. By the Second Temple period, they would go back and gather the bones and put them in a little bone box. Some of you remember the Biblical Archaeology Review articles years ago about how they found a bone box that they think could have held the bones of James. It was an ossuary, I think it's called. But it only had to be long enough as is it called the femur, the long bone of the leg, is the longest bone in the body. So the box only had to be that long. And then you could kind of stack them up there. Don't rely on my recall of anatomy, but whatever that long bone is, that's the one it was. So you would lay the person out on that bench that you can see there on the left-hand side, And then you see the little concave head space. So they would lay the skull into the head space and then align the body on the bench. They would come back a year later, collect the bones, and then put them down in the little depository. Now, on the side closest to us, what we would say is the right-hand side, you can count 5 head spaces. The first 4 are easy to see. The last one, I'll have to show you another picture so that you can see it more clearly. But there's 5 head spaces carved there, so it could hold up to 5 bodies on the right-hand side. But fortunately, it had rained the day before we visited there, and you can see the rain collected in that one at the top. You can see an outline there like a mummy. That's because there's water and stuff in it. So you can see the head space pointed toward us, and then that mummy-like carving for the rest of the body. There's filled with water. But if you'll notice the shape of it, kind of the theme we're looking at here is chai, life, living, eventually resurrection. So the shape of the benches is in the shape of a chet. And so when the bones are collected, you can see the depository there in the middle. So the first one to be buried in that space is going to be considered the patriarch of the family. So his bones will be put down there. And then as each person in the family dies, and then the bones are collected a year later, they're put down into that same depository. And that's where you, first of all, one, you lie down with your fathers. And in the second part of the process, you are gathered to, because your bones are gathered in with theirs, and then they're all mixed up together. Like I say, the resurrection should be quite a thing to see when all those bones have to start sorting themselves out. But the cool thing was they did find one of these graves undisturbed, and so they have they now have the DNA of first century priests, which is pretty incredible. You can see there a closer shot, and that's where you can see the head space there for that last body space on the bench. So this guy, kind of forming the roof of the chet, that's probably going to be considered the patriarch of that family or that particular clan. You can see it better there. And yes, I was walking all over the graves. So. That's down inside the bone box. And you can see some of the others. There were more, and I've got more pictures, but it's pretty much like this, just carved out of the rock. So we went over this, I think last week, I'm not sure. Anyway, we know that Israel sees Joseph, and he says, now let me die, since I have seen your face, that you're still alive. And the word that I pointed out there was hapa'am, where the red arrow is, because it's an odd statement. Why is he saying this time I can die? Because I've seen your face that you're alive. So there was a hint there of resurrection. You are still alive. The one who I thought was dead, as it turns out, he's not only alive, he's practically royalty. He's in charge of all Egypt. He's second in command of Pharaoh. So it's not just resurrection from the dead, it's a glorious. In fact, that's what Joseph tells his brothers when he tells them to go back to Jacob and take the news. He says, tell him of all my splendor here in Egypt. So it's a way of explaining to us, even in these early Torah portions, that resurrection from the dead is possible. And it's very subtle. It's hinted at in the Hebrew texts, like hapa'am, this time I can die because I've seen your face. You're like, I believe in a resurrection because you, Joseph, who once were dead, you are now alive. And so now I have no fear of the second death. And the other verse that I've got up there, it says, Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. So we have a lot of neck weeping going on in the Torah portions here. We've got Benjamin's necks, which represent the two temples that were built in his territory and their destruction. We have Benjamin weeping on Joseph's neck, singular. So we've got a picture of the ark and the Shekinah departing from the tabernacle at Shiloh, which is going to be in the sons of Joseph's territory. And so what does this represent? We know what Benjamin's necks represent. We know what Joseph's neck represents. But what exactly does Israel's neck represent? That's our thought question. And then the second question is, why is Israel comfortable with death? Now that he has seen Joseph, what makes it okay? And I think it's going to go back to realizing the one who was dead was only thought to be dead. And that's the way it is with us. We think of death with a certain degree of finality, but the distinguishing thing about a Messiah is, along with the doctrine of Messiah that the Pharisees gave us, was an expectation of resurrection with that Messiah. And so that's going to be a part of this theme. That which was thought to be dead is in all reality merely been concealed unto an appointed time. And so when Jacob sees Joseph, or when Israel sees Joseph, now he's okay with dying. It's a reassurance that even though we may seem to be dead, the truth is things are happening in ways that we can't see, we're unaware of, maybe, in this physical life, but the truth is we're still alive. And it's okay to die once we realize that. So we've got our allusions to the temple here, and I put those on a PowerPoint so that if you wanted to go back and look at them later, you could see the traditional rabbinical viewpoint of the neck imagery. I'm not going to belabor it because we talked a little bit about it last week. And the first and second death being typified by seeing Joseph alive, the one who was dead, right? And then just a reminder that even Rashi is equating these two deaths with the world to come. And a review again. When they told him all the words of Joseph that he had spoken to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father was revived. Okay, there's another resurrection. The spirit is being revived. There's another hint to us. What's interesting about the hint, though, is that Jacob's spirit, and notice how we're getting a toggling back and forth of Jacob and Israel. We know he's been renamed as Israel, but at certain times, it'll toggle back to Jacob. And we say, well, what's the pattern here? I don't know. I think we could figure it out, but there's a lot to figure out in the Torah portion because I don't think I got past one chapter in terms of the material to cover. And we didn't even get into the blessings. But in this particular instance, it's the wagons that Joseph sends that seem to be the catalyst. In fact, there's two. It says, Jacob's spirit resurrected at the sight of wagons. First of all, it says, when they told him all the words of Joseph. So what's happening? He's hearing something. He's hearing Joseph's words. But it's not being described in a receiving sense, like, Shema, I want you to hear it. That's not how it's worded. It's when the brothers told him. The action is coming more from the brothers than in the receiving of the father, Jacob. So it's in the telling of the story. It's in the telling of the resurrection that somehow Jacob's spirit is being revived. And the second part of that equation, I'll go back up there and let you look at it again. When they told him the words of Joseph, that he had spoken to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. So there's two parts. The telling of the story, the telling of the resurrection. Wasn't that the major part and component of the gospel? Once Yeshua has resurrected, isn't that what the disciples and the apostles are going out and telling? They're telling the words of the son of Joseph. And certain people will react to that telling of that resurrection story with faith, and it revives their spirit because they believe the story. They believe the resurrection. The second part of the component here that's making an impact on the resurrection of Jacob's spirit is he sees wagons. You say, wagons? What is this, Gunsmoke? The wagons are important. And then my thought question to just drive you crazy was, why does the text keep toggling between Jacob and Israel? So let's go to the wagons. This we can fix these wagons. Leviticus 7, starting with verse 6. It says, and Moses took the wagons and the oxen and gave them unto the Levites. 2 wagons and 4 oxen he gave unto the sons of Gershon, according to their service. And 4 wagons and 8 oxen he gave unto the sons of Merari, according to their service, under the hand of Itamar, the son of Aharon the priest. So we know the sons of Kohath did not receive wagons. They had to bear the most holy objects. They had to be borne on their shoulders. And I think it's very interesting that burial place of the Kohanim that I showed you the pictures of is called Ketef Chinom, or the shoulder of Chinom. And with that particular burden, so to speak. But anyway, getting back to the wagons, we've got the clan of Gershon and the clan of Merari, and their names are very significant. But now we have a reference point for why Jacob's spirit would be revived when he saw wagons specifically. And in fact, the wagon in Hebrew, I believe, is agla, which is like egel. Egel is a calf, like a cow, a young cow. And so the word agla is like a calf. And here's the words. Gershon, its definition means expulsion or exile. And there's a play on word within the word. Ger is a stranger, and Shon means a tongue. So this clan that's receiving the wagons to help bear the tabernacle, the residing place of the Shekhinah, their wagons have that allusion to somebody that's going to be speaking a strange tongue. And we see that process. When the disciples go out and they start telling the story, remember they had to pick a 12th disciple because Judas was just a swinging at that point. They're coming in with 12 disciples, and I don't know if we'll have time to get there tonight, but if we keep making these word associations, it will carry us all the way to the book of Revelation and the foundation stones of the apostles. It's got the gates here of the clans, of the tribes of Israel, but there's also the foundation stones of the apostles. Why? Because those 12 apostles go out and they start proclaiming the story that Joseph is not dead. The son of Joseph is not dead. He's alive. What happens? Spirits revive. People start saying, what do I need to do to repent? And so the wagon is kind of, in this way, our baton. We can look at the connection to the wagons and see what the story is. Those who have been expelled, those who have been exiled, those who are speaking a strange tongue will have the story told to them and their spirits will be revived. The second part of the wagon story is the clan of Merari, which means bitter. It's the same root word as maror at Pesach. It's the same word as the spice myrrh, which is very bitter smelling if you just smell it by itself. But it is a burial spice, and it was one of the burial anointments that the women would have taken to anoint Yeshua's body after his burial. But it means bitterness. And so we can associate Merari with Passover, with bitter herbs. We can associate Gershon, the ger, the stranger, with Sukkot. Because remember, Sukkot is the Feast of the Nations. So it's when those who were driven afar off, that's when we would expect them to return at Sukkot. So the wagons give us the range between Passover and Sukkot. Therefore, they're prophesying not just of the beginning and the end, but of everything in between. Because remember, the menorah is one piece of beaten gold. There might be 7 branches, there might be 7 feasts, but they're one. They're different ways of explaining the same message. So let's look a little deeper into the Torah portion. Genesis 48:7. Jacob is speaking to Joseph, and he's trying to explain himself. Because he's asking Joseph, please don't leave me here in Egypt, which we know is a metaphor for hell, basically. It can also represent the nations of the earth. But remember Abaddon and the king of Egypt, the king of Abaddon, we studied that in Revelation a little bit. So Jacob doesn't want to be left in Abaddon. He doesn't want to be left in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. He doesn't want to be left in exile. And there's a parallel there. And I don't know if I left the parallels on there, but one of the parallels is Jacob did not bury Rachel at Hebron. He basically left her exiled or separated from the tomb of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. Therefore, because Rachel dies on the way, as he's explaining to Joseph here in this verse, because Rachel dies in a place of separation and remains there, he's afraid that Joseph may not return him. He knows he also is going to die in a place where it's not going to be so easy to carry those bones back to Egypt. In fact, he'll probably have to be loaded on a wagon to get those bones back to Egypt. So it's kind of like measure for measure. You bury your wife outside of the proper burial place. What should you be concerned about? That you also are going to die a distance from your destination. Remember, the destination ultimately would have been Hebron via Bethlehem and Ephrat, or Ephratah. They're not exactly the same, but they're very close. It's like one hillside and another hillside right next to it. And I gave the morning class some approximate walking distances, so it would give you a pretty good idea of, as they're going probably down from Mount Moriah, what would later be called Jerusalem, as they're going across there, basically passing right by those pictures where I showed you that burial place that faces across the valley from the temple. They're walking that road. Looks like they're going to Hebron, because if you go through Bethlehem and Ephrat, you're going in a straight line from Jerusalem to Hebron, by the way. So Jacob is explaining this. He says, now as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died to my sorrow in the land of Canaan on the journey, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrat, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrat, that is, Bethlehem, the house of bread. So Ephrat, you can hear, again, sometimes the sages aren't sure exactly what the root is alluding to. You can hear the Barat aspect of fruitfulness in Ephrat, like the Euphrates River, the Barat River of Eden. But you can also hear the word afar for ashes. So which is it? Well, you can see the confusion in the naming of Benjamin. Is it the son of my suffering, like ashes? Or is it the son of my right hand, like Sukkot, Barat River? It's going to be that tithe of first fruits. It's going to be part of the Feast of Sukkot. So which is it, Passover or Sukkot? And both. Both names are called in Benjamin. Ben Oni, son of my suffering, but Ani is like the poor. You eat the bread of the poor at Passover. Or is he the son of my right hand? Is he the son of the king at Sukkot? Yes. So in Benjamin, we can see both pictures. But I want you to see here where the red arrow is, and I couldn't get it all the way over without covering up Lechem from Bethlehem. But he says there was still some distance to go to Ephrat. Now remember what we said about Hebron traditionally being the entrance, not the center, the entrance back to the Garden of Eden. This is where the patriarchs and the matriarchs want to be buried. This is where they want to be gathered. This is where they want to lie down with their fathers. This is where they want to be gathered to their people as a sign of the resurrection, as a sign of life. But with Rachel, it says there was still some distance to go to Ephrat. If we put that in the context of our feast day, there was still some distance to go to Sukkot. There was still some distance to go to the end of things. The word there for distance is kivrat. If you want to draw it out a little bit, it's kiverat. Kiverat, but that's like a shva, so it's going to be kivrat, aretz. And all it is, let's see, here we go. And what you put with it, like in this particular text, 48:7, you're going to soften the bait to kivrat, but the word is actually barat. It'll take the hard bait sound in other usages. So there is another use of the word barat, and it's after Naaman dips 7 times in the Jordan. He goes back to Elisha, tries to give him gifts of silver and gold and so forth, and Elisha says, absolutely no way, and sends him away. And then Gehazi, of course, ran after him and was trying to get some loot out of the deal. But in 2 Kings 5:19, Elisha says to Naaman, go in peace. So he departed from him some distance. So NASB is using the same translation as some distance. It's actually a short distance. If we look at it in context, it's not that far. So let's look at some things that we never thought we'd be interested in, and that's measurements. I did a lot of map rattling this afternoon in the Torah class, but if you have a throwaway map of Israel that you don't mind marking up, get you a protractor and a pencil and start working these things out. With using Jerusalem, the Temple Mount as your center point, and then stretch out to Hebron and let that be your entrance point, and then just drag your protractor around and see what interesting points will pop up in that radius, in a approximate radius, the same radius as Hebron. Because what you'll notice is that Bethlehem, and Ephrat, they're about halfway between Jerusalem and Hebron. Kind of interesting, the placement there. If you go in another direction, it lands almost squarely on the Jordan River, where it's believed that John the Baptist would have been immersing people and where Yeshua would have gone to be immersed. And then you move up this way and you're getting close to Beitel. And so just look at some of the things on those lines as you stretch them around if you have a protractor handy. But I want to look at some measurements here with this some distance, which in Hebrew was barat. Like, you can remember it if you think of bratwurst. You'll remember how to pronounce it. Just don't say worst. It's barat. So scripture gives us measurements. One measurement is an amma, and the plural of it is amot. For us who are used to using inches, that's going to be, they estimate somewhere between 18.96 and 22.56 inches, or 1 pace. So as you're walking, 1 stride forward is a pace. So depending on how big or how long your legs are, you might be hitting more in the 18-inch pace or the 22.5 pace. So they're not sure exactly, thank you, how big the pace was, but that's a pretty good estimate. You say, well, why do I need to know that? Because if you want to understand the distance that Jacob is talking about, where Rachel dies, he says it was some distance. Or if you want to know how far Naaman rode his chariot away from Elisha before Gehazi tracked him down, it's a short distance. It's a Barat. So what is a Barat? A Barat is going to be 2,000 amot. So 2,000 paces. Now you can get your calculator and calculate out how many inches, if you want to, that 2,000 paces would be. But it's, I'm going to guess it's around a kilometer. It's sometimes with the biblical measurements, the kilometers are actually easier. But that measurement, it's not idle. Like we say, the jots and the tittles are even important in Scripture. And so if Jacob thought, well, actually twice it's recorded in the actual account of Rachel's death, it tells us that it was a short distance from Bethlehem and Ephrat. And then when Jacob retells the story, he basically tells it verbatim. He wants us to know, because then we're told twice, that she died a brat, kibrat, or kibrat, depending on the grammar of the sentence. This is how far it was from where she died, where her tomb is, which, if you go to Rachel's tomb today, Jerusalem has grown so much and Bethlehem has grown so much, they've practically grown into each other. So it's really hard to say when you've left Jerusalem and when you're into Bethlehem. And her tomb is right there between them. There's a big wall there. But it's not that far from Jerusalem. I gave the measurements and the time, the walking distance. It would take you about an hour and a half to walk there from Jerusalem. And we do more than that shopping. So, do you know your iPhone keeps track of how many steps you've taken in a day? That was disturbing, because Keisha always got more steps than we did. We haven't figured out how it said she would climb 30-something floors of stairs, and I didn't climb any. I don't know what she's doing, jumping up and down or something, making her iPhone count ascents of stairs. So don't believe what your iPhone tells you about how many steps you've taken or how many flights you've climbed. There were 4 of us doing the exact same thing and getting 4 different readings. So not that that has anything to do with the Torah portion. So look at another way of measuring something. Because remember, back up here, we say an amot is a pace. A pace is a walking pace. So if we're looking at a barat, we're looking at a land measure as opposed to maybe a liquid measure, or what do you call it? Like the scooping out of the grain that's measured by the hand or by the finger. It's not one of those measurements. This is specifically for a land measure. It's for the earth. In fact, you saw that in the Hebrew of the verse that I pulled up there for you. It said eretz. To make sure you didn't just understand from the word barat that it's talking about a land measure, but when it says eretz, that's like double. So 2,000 paces or 2,000 amot equal a barat, a land distance. So let's look at the Tehum, because this is what the rabbis liken the 2,000 amot to. It helps us understand how the earth can at the same time be described as a sphere and a square, or a cube, basically. In Revelation, And in case we don't get to it, I will scroll through all the rest of the PowerPoint so that when you go back, you can pause them and look at the verses if you want to that describe the cubes or the squares. But techum literally means a boundary, and it's the area within which one may walk on Shabbat without restriction. And remember, in the rivers of Eden from Genesis 2, it was the Chidekel River, which the counterpart in the physical realm is the Tigris River. That particular river was described as walking or going. Whereas the other two, it just says Sabav, or it circles. This innermost river, the Chidekel, says it walked around, but it walked fast because Chidekel, it means rapid and noisy. So it's walking fast, but it's still pacing. And this boundary on Shabbat, it limits how far you can walk on Shabbat. There's no limit to how far you can walk on any other day. But on Shabbat, there is a boundary called a techum. And that techum is going to be 2,000 amot, a Barat. There may be a hint there that the reason Rachel was buried where she was buried is because there was a limitation on how far they could walk with her. If she died on a Shabbat, then there is a limitation. There is this Barat, and you have to stay in this land distance. So possibly, if she died on a Shabbat, that's why they chose that place to bury her. And so here's a picture to help you visualize. The one on the left is more of the proper circle. And this is remember, a Shabbat picture. And also remember, in Judaism, a man's wife is his Shabbat. She is his Shabbat rest. So there's a lot of symbolism in Shabbat, and they supposed to treat their wives extra special nice on Shabbat because of the spiritual picture that she represents of Shabbat rest in the garden. So picture yourself at the center of the circle in the graphic. And so no matter which way you turn from that center point, if you walk or if you pace 2,000 amot, that is the restriction on how far you may walk. But this is only going to, and I don't know if we want to go here because this gets deeper into Jewish law. It's not going to apply if you're in a highly populated area, because you can walk as far as you want to in a populated area, or say within a walled city. That's all within an eruv is what it's called. But this area where Rachel died, where her tomb is, you don't see a lot of houses out there today, so I can't imagine that it would have been a highly populated area back when they journeyed that road. So did they observe this? Who knows? But the text is not idle. It's not empty. So if the Jews have passed down to us a Sabbath day's journey, which even in the New Testament, it'll talk about a Sabbath day's journey, about how far you can go, especially outside of a populated area. You're at the center, 2,000 paces in any direction, that's your limitation. But the shaded area that you see on the graphic is the techum. of those 2,000 amot. So when you're talking about the amot, you're talking about a circle. You're talking about, I know what singular is radius. I don't know what plural is, radii or something. Maybe it's a radio. But the tehum is the square. How do you come up with the tehum? Well, it talks about the four corners of the earth. We know the earth is round, as it's described in Genesis 2, because of the circular pattern that it's described there. But it's also described as having north, south, east, and west, and described as having corners. So to come up with the shaded area that you see as the tehum, what you would do is you would put a little point on north, on south, on east, and on west. Connect your dots, and what you have is a square. You'll end up eventually with a cube. When you start thinking in spiritual terms, when you transfer this from a single plane and start thinking of it as that Ezekiel's wheel within the wheel, when all of a sudden those rivers of Eden start moving and rotating within themselves, and all of a sudden you can step in between the wheels. And we know those wheels can go in any direction without actually having to turn. Why? Because they spin. So you've got a square that's enclosing a sphere. So there's a depth perception that we're not going to get looking at a flat piece of paper or on a PowerPoint. There's a more practical representation in the graphic on the right. This one's stretched in a more rectangular depiction because the actual population area, if you'll notice, it's not a single person, it's several people represented there by the little squares. And you see them arranged in more of a rectangular pattern. And so therefore your 2,000 amot, it's not just being calculated from one person, it's being calculated from the group. And in that case, it kind of stretches out into a rectangle. It's the same principle though. Your 2,000 paces from the center are what define your boundary or the Barat. And that's why I think it's hinting possibly that that's why Rachel was buried where she was buried. Doesn't explain why they wouldn't have taken her after Shabbat though. But maybe there's just a picture and a prophecy there. This probably will not interest you, but if it does, you're welcome to go back in the recording and look at it. But these are the most ancient measures. And there's newer ones by the time we get to the New Testament that are based on Greek and Persian and so forth. And there's even a parasa that was derived from Persia and the ancient Israelite measurements. And you can see there, it's the last one on the list there. So you've got the palm, the tefach. You need that because you measure the grain. You also measure with etzbaot. An etzba is a finger. So again, as the priest is scooping up incense or grain, he needs those particular kinds of measurements. You've got a span, which is equal to 3 palms. Palms of the hand, not palm trees. That would be quite a long span, called the tefachim. And you'll see a lot of this in the book of Vayikra. 1 L is the same as an amah, like we're talking about amot, and that's equal to 2 spans. A mil is equal to 2,000 Ls, or 2,000 amot. And then a parasang, or a parasa, is equal to 4 mils, but not miles, not the same thing. So there's a little information down there if that interests you. Because eventually, if we kept following this thread to the very end, we would end up going through Ezekiel. Not just to look at his wheels, but to look at his cubes. Ezekiel describes the cubes that suggest New Jerusalem. And so that explains, again, the graphics. If you can't remember what I said, then there's an easier way of explaining it right there. That's basically, you've got a center point and you go 2,000 paces in any direction. Okay, how my time doing? My time's doing horrible. I want to go back to this cube or this square that's represented by the tehum that connects the amot. And our hint there was it had something to do with Rachel and her death and the fact that she was still that short distance, or that 2,000 paces from Bethlehem when she died, about 1 kilometer. And then from that, the Barat, that's where they derive the tahum, that you can actually create the square there. And again, remember the corners. You've got corners in the rules concerning the cultivation of a field, and you leave those corners for the stranger, the alien, the orphan, and the widow. So in Revelation, we know it says, the one who spoke with me had a gold measuring rod to measure the city, its gates, and its wall. We're talking about New Jerusalem now. Whereas you can see that when Rachel dies, as Jacob is trying to tell Joseph, they've apparently just come from Jerusalem, except it wasn't Jerusalem at that time. It was called by different names in history. Like Melchizedek was the priest of Shalem, possibly the same location. Mount Moriah, the same location. So it says in Revelation 21:15, it says the city is laid out as a square, and its length is as great as the width. And he measured the city with the rod, 1,500 miles, and its length and its width and its height are equal. So we have a cube. Is there any precedent for Jerusalem that would make us think of a cube? Possibly this tehum, this distance where Rachel is buried. Other instances where things are described as square. 1 Kings 7:5, it says all the doors and posts were square with the windows, and light was against light in 3. Ezekiel 43:16, that's what I say. Logically, if we keep chasing this, we'll have to go through Ezekiel. It says the altar shall be 12 cubits long, 12 broad, square in the 4 squares thereof. So it's a different measurement, but still in a square. Let's see if I can move this where I can read it. It says in Ezekiel 45:2, of this there shall be for the sanctuary 500 in length, 500 in breadth. And notice the strange wording, square, roundabout, and 50 cubits roundabout for the suburbs thereof. Okay, so I'm just pulling those things in isolation, but so you can see some examples of where the square seems to be associated with the temple, the location of Jerusalem. And it's possible for something to be both square and round at the same time. And again, traditionally it's going to be associated with Shabbat because of the limitation of the journey, of the walk, of the pacing. Okay, we'll skip through this because we did this last week. And just as a reminder, what is a Hebrew? It's one that passes over a river. And that's what it says in Genesis 15:18. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants, I have given this land, from the river of Egypt, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. Remember, Euphrates is the Barat river. It means the fruitful river. We associate it with the Feast of Sukkot because you bring the first fruits at Sukkot. And Babylon, ironically, is basically on the banks of the Euphrates. What does it say? By the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept for Zion. But it's called the Great River, a fruitful river. And remember, it feeds the others. And that's why you've got first fruit feasts, both in the spring at Passover, at Shavuot, and at Sukkot. And so the rabbis have answered this question for us. Why was Rachel buried where she was buried? Well, they said she had to see her children walking away to Babylon. And she would intercede for them. She would see their exile. But 70 years later, she would see them return. Remember, the thing with Jacob is when he saw the wagons, that we associate it with Gershon, the exile, the one who's been expelled, and Merari, the bitter herbs of Pesach. Because Gershon, the stranger, is going to come back at Sukkot. What starts at Passover will be completed at Sukkot. And so in Rachel, we see the same thing. We see her supervising their exile, interceding for 70 years until they return from the nations, till they return from Babylon. She's interceding, weeping for her children. And here's just some different thoughts that kind of wrap this up. It's been a little bit scattered in this second session because I knew there was no way I could get to the end of it. But think of going down to Egypt as an expulsion and a virtual death. In a sense, those who are separated from Israel are dead. Wow. If you're separated from Israel, you're exiled and you're dead. But we have prophecies of a Messiah, of a shepherd, who is going to shepherd as far away as he needs to go to return the exiles from death. So, being in Egypt, being in Mitzrayim, which is tribulation, being in Abaddon, which is hell and death. Remember from Revelation, those two things go together. Yeshua came, the son of Joseph came, to redeem us from exile and to redeem us from death. So we see Rachel. She dies on the way to Ephrat. She's not buried in the cave of Machpelah, which means she's still interceding for the exiles because they left again. She was never gathered to her fathers in Hebron. Never was. So she's still weeping for her children. She fell short of Sukkot. She fell short of Ephrat. And she was left there so no one would be left behind. So I have a hunch that at the resurrection of the dead, that's part of what we'll understand about Rachel, as she will be gathered when her children are gathered, and she will not stop weeping for her children until they are gathered to the fathers. Okay, you already know this, so I'll skip over it. Here's some of the language of Rachel. The children of whom you were bereaved will yet say in your ears, the place is too cramped for me. Make room for me that I may live here. Then you will say in your heart, who's begotten these for me? Since I have been bereaved of my children, I'm barren, an exile, and a wanderer. Who reared these? Well, somebody did in the land of their exile. Where do these come from? Thus says the Lord God, behold, I will lift up my hand to the nations and set up my standard to the peoples, and they will bring your sons in their bosom, and your daughters will be carried on their shoulders. Who are these who fly like a cloud and like doves to their lattices? Surely the coastlands will wait for me. The ships of Tarshish will come first to bring your sons from afar, their silver and their gold with them. For the name of the Lord your God and for the Holy One of Israel, because he has glorified you. And remember, like, you notice that Joseph loaded Benjamin down with silver when he sent him back. When we go to that one other mention outside of the Torah where it talks about the Barat, the little distance of land, kind of a Shabbat hint. What did Naaman bring to Elisha? He brings him silver and gold. Why? Because a little exiled girl had said, I'm so sorry you have leprosy. I wish you'd go visit Israel. And so he loads up silver and gold because what? She told him the story. So it's two parts. You tell the story of the resurrection, and then they will see the wagons. They will see the wagons of the returning exiles, the people of a strange tongue, who have been redeemed by a Pesach lamb, by the bitter herbs of Yeshua's death. The exiles will come back. Zechariah points out something very specific. When he's talking about the messianic reign, what we notice is maybe if the Holy One planted a garden and we were supposed to protect it, and obviously we didn't. But if the commandment is be fruitful and multiply, do you think perhaps he intended for the borders of that garden to stretch out and to cover more territory? Because the specific regulations that are given to Israel proper, which is the observance of the feasts, if you don't come up at the feasts, if you don't celebrate Sukkot, then you'll get no rain. And that's something the scribe was talking to me about week before last. He was saying, with every other nation on earth, if they get rain, it's meaningless. He says, in Israel, if we get rain, it's because we've been good. It's because we obeyed. It depends upon that. There's a dependency. There's a cause and effect, specific cause and effect in Israel that at this point in history does not extend to the nations. In the messianic reign of Messiah Yeshua, that same provision, that same cause and effect will be extended, it says, to all the nations that went against Jerusalem. They will have to go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, to celebrate Sukkot. And if they don't go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. You got to be good. You got to obey the commandment. You don't get to choose your holiday. You can choose it, but it's going to get dry and you're going to need lots of moisturizer because you get no rain. The boundaries are extended. And he mentions a specific nation so that we will understand what we need to understand about the Messianic reign is we have to go back and we have to look at the story of Egypt. Because it says that the family of Egypt does not go up or enter. See how it represents all nations if you look at it in context? We're looking at a story about a specific country called Egypt, but Egypt represents all nations. If the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them. It will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations who do not go up to celebrate Sukkot. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations who do not go up to celebrate the feast of Sukkot. So we're practicing. We're getting in the groove here because eventually we'll get thirsty, right? So I don't know if, let me see what time it is. Yeah, we better quit. I'll just kind of scroll through these PowerPoints. And if you want extra study this week, you can go through them and try to figure out what point I would have made. But I do have the prophecy in here about the shepherd. And again, the rod. Measure against measure. With a rod, they will smite the judge of Israel on the cheek. But then again, who does it talk about? The shepherd says, as for you, Bethlehem Ephratah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from days of eternity. Therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel. And he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord and the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. They will remain, because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth. This one will be our peace. When the Assyrian invades our land, when he tramples on our citadels, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 leaders of men. And he will shepherd the land of Assyria with a sword, the land of Nimrod at its entrances. He will deliver us from the Assyrian when he attacks our land, when he tramples our territory. Then the remnant of Jacob will be among many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers on vegetation, which do not wait for man or delay for the sons of men. The remnant of Jacob will be among the nations, among many peoples. So I think that sums up why Jacob's spirit revived when he saw the wagons. He saw the wagons of Gershon and Merari long before Moses gave them to those clans. And he saw us long before we began to return with our strange tongues back to the land of our fathers, taking those steps back. This Revelation 21:17, it talks about, again, they're doing the measuring. And it says, according to the measure of a man, that is, of an angel. And remember what Jacob says in this Torah portion, goes back to the shepherd. He blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. So now we see why it was so important to Jacob for his bones also to be gathered to that place. He believed, like Abraham, that the exiles would return, because Abraham was warned about the exile in Egypt. Isaac believed, and he was gathered to his father. Jacob believed. He wanted to be gathered to his fathers. And because of that heritage of faith that Paul talks about, that we now have when he's writing to the Ephesians in chapter 2, read that chapter, read Ephesians 2, and he will remind us that we who formerly were afar off, we were the expelled ones, like Gershon. We've been brought back in wagons. And it's going to revive Jacob's spirit to see us. It's going to revive Rachel to see us returning. And this is just an article that I took out of Will Panor's newsletter this week because it was about the naming of Ephraim and Manasseh. You can read that in your spare time if you want to. But I think it'll get you excited about learning Hebrew. And that's it.